Hi there, everyone. My name is Lauren Spring, and I am an art educator with adult programs at the AGO. Thank you for joining us today for one of our Mental Health Moment virtual mini tours. Before I launch into sharing the two works of art that I've selected to include in the tour today, I do just want to acknowledge the land that we're on. The Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto has always been a trading center for First Nations. So the first work of art that I would like for us to look at together today is this work by Christiana Flug. Now, this particular painting is called With the Black Flag, and it was painted in 1971. Christiana Flug had a really fascinating life. I just want to address a few things that might jump out at folks right away when you first observe this painting. For example, when I tour in person with groups, many people notice the black flag right away, this kind of striking black flag right at the center of the work. There's also evidence that she's taken a very different aesthetic approach in painting the buildings and the houses and the trees. The houses in the painting are quite stark and angular, but you can see that the trees are rather windswept, almost, as some people have pointed out, kind of suffocatingly so. And I also just want you to note you can see those two tall apartment buildings there and an airplane just to the left of one of them in the sky. This was a key feature in many of Flug's paintings of this time period. Quite frequently when painting an outdoor scene, you'll almost always notice a flying airplane or a bird in the distance. So Christiana Flug did have a rather difficult and fascinating life. She was born in Berlin, Germany in 1936, and she was actually rather quickly sent out of the city to live with relatives and others outside of Berlin during the war. Between 1941 and 1949, her mother was working as a nurse, and so it wasn't safe for Christiana to be there. And so family members took care of her, many of whom were rather cruel and strict with her. And reportedly, this resulted in Flug, who was already an introverted child, retreating even more into herself, into her books, into her drawing. And she was reunited with her mother after 1949. In 1953, she moved to Paris, where she met her husband. He was studying to become a medical doctor, and she was studying fashion design in the city. In 1956, the two were married, and very soon after, she gave birth to two daughters, Esther and Ursula. Together, the family moved to Munich and then to Tunis, Africa, for different medical internships that her husband Michael was doing. And then finally, in 1959, the family moved to Toronto, where her husband worked as a doctor and Christiana painted from home and was in charge of all of the domestic work and caring for her two young daughters. She also taught at the Ontario College of Art throughout the 1960s. Flug's talent was recognized early on when she moved to Toronto, and she came to be represented by one of the most prominent art dealers in the city, Avram Isaacs. And he recognized her unique aesthetic and helped her kind of launch her career, and she became very successful selling her work. She did, however, often lament that without her husband's income, she wouldn't be able to support herself and her daughters. And while she did remark how lucky she was to be able to work from home and to be an artist, she also frequently discussed how constrained she felt by being in the domestic sphere. Part of the reason for this was that her canvases were very large and essentially impossible to carry outdoors. So she had to work from home. And also as an immigrant, she said she had trouble fitting in or bonding with others in Toronto. And she, I think, also felt, as I'm sure a lot of parents, especially today, can relate to, somewhat constrained by being responsible for the subsistence needs of both of her daughters. She frequently felt that kind of caring for them full time left her with little time to create as many works of art that she wanted to. A number of her early portraits were actually of her daughter's dolls. She said that when her daughters were too little to actually sit for a portrait, the dolls were more obedient. And using them as a subject matter sort of elicits kind of this sense of sort of loneliness and the domestic sphere and child rearing all at once. As her children aged, she did do a number of fascinating portraits of them, often sitting on the balcony reading or playing, and they were being watched by Flug. Her perspective is kind of from inside the kitchen, and then you can see them through the open balcony door. In one of these paintings, Ursula, one of her daughters, was kind of wearing summer attire and surrounded by lush green leaves out on the balcony. But interestingly, the reflection on the balcony door is of a very harsh winter, those same trees, but in a very different season, that exact same view, but a very different moment in the year. And I've been thinking a lot about these paintings, as so many of us have been spending so much time now going on the third season of kind of being more or less constrained in our homes, and time takes on this funny form that suddenly seems unfamiliar, devoid of our regular structures. And yeah, we've had to watch the seasons pass from a particular perspective. For Flug, this really manifested in what has been called this magic realist style. So very much grounded in her domestic reality, and the rawness of kind of everyday life, but also taking on this sort of surreal magic realist element at the same time. She would also often paint birds in cages, I think also in reference to this theme of confinement. And there are frequent paintings of her daughters in cribs too that seem similarly constrained. Going back to this particular painting that we have in front of us today, you'll notice if you look at the very, very bottom, there's this kind of silvery reflective surface. This is actually Flug's windowsill. And she would always do this, or most of the time when she was doing these, what seemed to be landscape works, she'd always put a little bit of a hint of her windowsill in there to remind the viewer essentially that that this was painted from home in her domestic setting. The Black Canadian flag at the center of this work is also likely indicative of the bouts of depression that Flug endured while living in Toronto, and that resulted in her eventual suicide on Hanlan's Point Beach in the Toronto Islands in 1972. Given that most of Christiane Flug's artworks are inspired by her immediate surroundings, and that much of her painting features city views seen from the window and doors of her apartment, I thought that she might be a particularly good artist to discuss today. Given that we're now, those of us in Toronto at least, seem to be headed into the second wave of this pandemic. And so many of us, even if we have enjoyed summers outdoors and maybe traveling, within Ontario or our own country, I think we're kind of bracing ourselves to spend a long, dark winter in our homes with limited access to the outside world again. And so one of the questions that I thought it might be neat for us to ponder while looking at this particular painting is, how might your home and working from home represent both freedom and confinement? Again, Flug, and I think many of us too, could relate to the fact that, there's a certain amount of freedom to be able to work from home and sort of be a parent while completing work that you do for an income. Perhaps some of us don't necessarily miss the long commutes to work. So there are elements that are freeing, but also can be quite constricting. And so I'm interested in that interplay between the two. The next artist I want to discuss today is one who, unlike Flug, wasn't lucky enough to sell his paintings or have them really recognized during his lifetime. And this is Vincent van Gogh. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard Vincent van Gogh's name, and you might associate him with some of his most well-known works like The Starry Night, or some of his Japanese woodblock print-inspired apple blossom trees, or generally kind of wild and bold, expressive post-impressionist landscapes, or even anecdotes about a madness that he went through where he cut off part of his own ear. But the work that I'm sharing with you today is a much earlier piece. And this one, which is titled A Woman with Spades Seen from Behind, was painted in 1885. And now this is before Vincent van Gogh met with the Impressionists, and before he really came into his own post-impressionist, very vivid, bold landscape style. Interestingly, when you look at this work, you might think it's quite calm and serene, but it does represent a particularly tumultuous time in Van Gogh's life. Um, it's part of a series of works of his that have come to be called peasant character studies. He had just moved back to the Netherlands at this point after studying abroad. And he did a series of works about peasants, people working the land, kind of hard laborers. And he became quite fascinated with this particular demographic, likely found their work to be quite grounding and very different from what he had experienced in art schools. So a little bit of background on his life leading up to this particular time period. He was born in 1853, but only started painting in 1881. Van Gogh was born into a wealthy family, and he initially wanted to be a minister, a Calvinist minister, but soon after embarking on religious studies became rather disillusioned by religion in general. And this set him on a search that lasted many years for his calling. He studied art in Belgium and elsewhere in Europe, and he moved around a great deal as a young man, often getting himself into trouble and starting conflicts almost wherever he went. He was prone to frequent bouts of depression. He reportedly also went through psychotic episodes, and he certainly had trouble maintaining relationships, be they romantic, familial, or professional. Luckily for him, he did have a very kind and understanding brother named Theo, who often helped him through a lot of these difficult moments and supported him financially, professionally, personally. And their letters back and forth really, really speak volumes about their relationship and the care that Theo offered him. So after a number of years of training with different art teachers and tumultuous love affairs that often had very tragic endings in different parts of Europe, I mentioned Van Gogh returned to the Netherlands and began painting in this en plein air style. So he would do sketches, watercolors, and oil paintings of peasant characters. You can see here, this work is actually very illustrative of this particular aesthetic style. It's heavy on the earth tones, so very green and brown, very different from what would be coming in the next few years with his bright Impressionist style. Also very different than what the Impressionists were doing at the time. This was not the popular thing to be doing. And so that was part of the reason that he wasn't able to sell these works when he initially started painting them. His brother Theo, upon seeing works like this in this particular series, suggested to Van Gogh in 1986, the year after he painted this particular work, that he move to Paris and he start to familiarize himself with the Impressionists and kind of what was à la mode at the time, which he eventually did. But back to the work at hand today. So Van Gogh seems to have had a particular fascination with working people, particularly farmers, fishermen, and other hard laborers. And really between 1881 and 1885 is when he focused on this particular group in his portraits. He was also deeply inspired of works of realist artists like Jean-François Millet, whose detailed focus on real-life hard laborers helped elevate individual peasants to an almost heroic status on canvas. So this was a really interesting trend as part of what we call the realist movement in art history, was to focus on the everyday life that people were living. It was no longer Greek and Roman gods or Arthurian legends that were the focus of these paintings, but actually everyday men and women who were kind of elevated to this heroic status. And we can see that at play here. This woman seems very strong and at once is kind of very realistic. You can imagine him maybe seeing her in the field, but also sort of idealized. I don't know about you, but ever since the pandemic struck, I've been paying a lot more attention lately to the workers around me and the different type of work that we all do, whether it's in the domestic sphere, parenting, or just keeping a household running, or paid labor, and what kind of work is really considered essential when we come right down to it. I've also been paying a lot of attention to class differences between those whose work is done in the public sphere. So if we're thinking construction, food delivery, retail shops, supermarkets, migrant farm workers who came up and helped a lot of us in Ontario this summer, versus those whose work is more private and who've been more easily able to kind of set up a computer at home and stay out of harm's way during the pandemic. And there's certainly a class difference at play there, I'd say. And so Van Gogh has made me reflect on what sort of faces kind of blue-collar workers, migrant farm laborers, doctors, nurses who are also on the front lines of this pandemic are actually facing in their work these days. So I was wondering, my question for those of you tuning in today would be, if we were to do a similar kind of series of workers today, but during the pandemic, instead of, farm workers in the Netherlands in 1885, who would we paint, and why would we opt to elevate them to this kind of hero status? I'd be curious on a personal level, who in your own life, which workers do you see on a day-to-day basis that you'd opt to paint, or that maybe have become kind of heroic to you throughout the pandemic? Maybe it's your local grocery store worker who, you suddenly have a lot more empathy for and check in with once or twice a week when you go and do groceries now. I'd also be curious to know, whose work did you perhaps not recognize as being essential or important or heroic before the pandemic, again, that maybe you see differently now? Another question that thinking about Van Gogh's life and work has made me reflect on is how much his own mental health really impacted those who loved him. So as mentioned, his brother Theo was a constant support to him. And so I'd be curious to know, how has your own mental health changed over the past few months? And how has it impacted your family, your friends, your wider relationships? And also, how has the mental health of those close to you impacted your own family dynamics and your life in general? We tend to be living in much closer quarters with those very close to us right now. And so certainly in a small house or a small apartment, wherever you may be, you can probably sense the emotions and the mental wellness of those in your immediate vicinity more than you've noted before. So just something interesting to reflect on too. So I wanted to thank you very much for tuning in and joining me here today. We hope to see you again soon, and to welcome you back to the AGO for real tours whenever it's possible to do so.